So the title is using free AppAnnie data to optimize your next game. And I just to kind of give like a high concept overview of what the subject of the presentation is. I'm going to walk through kind of a framework for picking an audience for your next game. So basically a way to use AppAnnie data that's available for free for anybody to figure out who you should be making a game for as you're in the sort of concepting stage of the design process. So who am I? Scott hit the main points, but I'm sort of an owner and a partner at a mobile marketing agency called Heracles. I'm the owner of the website mobiledevmemo.com, and I wrote the book Freemium Economics. So the sort of thesis of this presentation is that you can't simply make a game. You have to make the right game. And I have like a little bit of market data here, but I won't spend too much time going through it. It's kind of like really obvious stuff. It's stuff that probably everyone in this room is already familiar with. But marketing costs are increasing because smartphone sales are slowing and people aren't downloading many new apps. There's sort of like a lot of data out there to support this idea, but this is some Flurry study that shows that time in apps is increasing, so people are using apps more and more, but the number of apps they're using is staying about the same. So they're not downloading new ones, they're just using the existing ones more on a sort of year-to-year basis. Smartphone penetration in the West is basically at saturation, so you've got countries that are even more than 100% smartphone penetration, meaning like the average person has more than one smart device. So people aren't really, there's no sort of like cohort of people that are getting smartphones for the first time in the West, in the developed world. People have smartphones, and when they buy new ones, they're simply replacing older devices. So these people aren't sort of like experiencing apps for the first time. They sort of like are aware of all of the apps that they need, and they have them already installed. And when they download an app, it's either because they replaced their device or because you've reached them with an ad or through some sort of viral channel. But people aren't sort of like downloading like apps because they've never, the concept of apps is novel to them. Everyone sort of is aware of the sort of like portfolio of apps that they need and they use. And then sort of set against that trend is an overall increase in mobile ad spending. So you see here that from 2015 to 2020, mobile ad spend in the US is basically set to double. So what does that mean? Well, there's more sort of demand for a fixed set of supply, right? I mean, time in apps is increasing so that the supply of inventory is going up a little bit, but the number of apps downloaded, or the number of apps used on average is staying about the same, and the number of people using apps is staying about the same. So there's not a huge increase in supply of ad inventory, but there is a huge increase in demand on that ad inventory, and as a result, the price is increasing. So as kind of like, another component to this, a lot of, everyone's sort of aware of this sort of stasis in the top 10 grossing chart, or even like the top 20, top 30 grossing chart. And that basically means your competitors either monetize users very, very well, or they have massive IP attachments that allow them to kind of offset their user acquisition costs. And you can see this just by opening up your device. I took this screenshot like last week, but it was kind of a few days into Pokemon Go. And if you take a look at all the games here, they're either kind of entrenched games that have been top grossing for a long time, or they're leveraging big IP, or they're sort of like brand extensions of entrenched games, or just portfolio extensions from developers with entrenched games. So Mobile Strike, a portfolio extension. Candy Crush Soda Saga, brand extension. Dragon Ball Z, big IP. Clash Royale, a brand extension. Clash of Clans, an entrenched game. So that's basically who you're competing with. People that don't really need to do UA. I mean, they can. They have the money to do it. But to acquire users, they don't really need to do it, or they don't need to do it at the same sort of price point that you do. So making games is expensive. If you develop and release the wrong game, you're potentially going to incur a massive loss. And that's just sort of the reality. So given all of that information, the question is, how do you vet a game before you launch it, right? So how do you make sure before you launch a game that you've made the right game, that you've made a game that reaches an audience that is capable of spending money, that wants to download games, that plays games, that's receptive to games? How do you do that? Because, I mean, you can't learn that in the global launch phase, because otherwise you've put a bunch of money at risk. And even learning that in the soft launch phase is risky. So how do you do that? You answer a couple of questions. Who wants to play this game that I'm making, that I'm thinking about making? Are there a lot of these people? So is there a big audience for this game? So I know that there are people that want to play it, but is that group of people very big? Can that support a top grossing game? Do these people have disposable income? Are they competitive or social? And will they respond to this game's ads? So number 1 and 2 kind of speak to size. So like size of your target demographic or size of the market for people to play your game. 3 is kind of related to monetization. 4 is related to sort of virality and being able to basically accrue extra users for each one that you acquire. And 5 is the ability to market your game. And so the sooner you can answer these questions, the less risk you bear. So if you kind of think about the development cycle, if you're kind of able to answer these questions at the concept stage, that's a relatively inexpensive exercise, right? Because if you're just doing it before you've committed a single line of code, then you haven't paid a bunch of engineers, you haven't paid art people, you haven't paid a staff to build something, right? You haven't taken months of those people's time to build something. So not only have you avoided the actual outlay of cash, but you also haven't incurred like an opportunity cost in putting those people on a project that's potentially more lucrative. If you wait into the soft launch phase, you haven't avoided that. You actually have done all those things. You've spent all that money on developing something that you don't know there's a market for, and you've also lost the opportunity to put those people on other things. And if you wait until, but at least you're doing it before you've spent a lot of money on launching it. And if you wait until the global launch phase, you're just incurring a ton of risk. If you have no idea how the game's going to perform, and you've already sort of committed lots of money probably to a launch. And so, this kind of like follows the risk/sunk development cost trajectory, right? So the earlier you can answer those questions, the less risk you bear, the less likely you are to release a game that no one's going to play or like. So then kind of understanding that, and if you sort of accept that concept that you need to sort of size the opportunity for your game before you start developing it, the sort of like next logical step in that reasoning is asking what an opportunity looks like. So I understand that I should be building a game for a large potential audience of paying users. The next question I need to ask myself is, okay, what do those people look like? How do I know what that audience looks like so that I can sort of back into a game concept that resonates with them? So I came up with this kind of diagram for thinking about that, and the kind of numbers on the right-hand side correspond to grossing ranks, right? So from the bottom up is like an ascension up the grossing ranks, and I think breaking the top 100 grossing chart down this way through the perspective of sort of like resonance, general resonance of like IP and game concept, and also difficulty in performing marketing, right? And so I think if you think about top 100 grossing down, to reach that position, sort of for any game, to reach that position, can be done with sort of basic UA. I mean, if the game's metrics work, if the game's monetization works, like the game sort of is a viable commercial game, you can get to top 100 grossing through sort of like basic UA. And by basic UA, I mean doing the sort of like very basic things that anybody with kind of like a sort of like a reasonable understanding of user acquisition could do, right? So here I'm talking about running UA ads on like maybe a handful of the bigger networks, doing kind of attribution to sort of measure installs, building some sort of like kind of basic LTV model, but doing all the sort of like basic things that a UA team might do without much sophistication, right? It's just sort of like, the sort of like most fundamental aspects of doing UA. And my point here is that you can get to the top 100 grossing position if you have a viable commercially viable game without much sophistication in your sort of like UA apparatus. Between 150, I think you need sort of more systematic UA and or general recognition of your game's IP. And by systematic UA, I mean there's got to be kind of like a more processized, focus to doing UA. You have to have kind of a team of people that know what they're doing. You probably like a little bit of automation with respect to like generating metrics and making decisions pretty quickly. Or you have a game that sort of offsets UA costs via some IP. Then that next tier is like between 50 and 20, and here I think you do need like sort of sophisticated UA and or widespread recognition, right? So I think here you're talking about doing UA kind of like at maximum scale on sort of like all the direct response networks, and then potentially even the sort of like, non-direct, running on the non-direct UA channels. So doing things like influencer marketing and kind of potentially even like out of home or TV, having an actual sophisticated operation with maybe like up to 10 people at like a pretty large scale. Or you have like really widespread recognition in terms of the IP of your game. And then 20 and up, 20 to 1, you need sort of like massive UA. You need like a massive UA operation or like a household name recognition, right? So I think here you're talking about like the major, the sort of like household name brands, like the different Marvel brands, or the household name celebrity attachments, and or like a massive UA operation comprised of like maybe up to 20, 30, 40 plus people, where like sort of each person has their own sort of like portfolio of networks, and it's all sort of running at a a level of professionalism that really only exists in maybe like 10 to 20 companies, right? The companies that exist at that sort of grossing tier. So this is all just to sort of say, this is all sort of like set of like a kind of framework for thinking about what an opportunity looks like, and how those opportunities are kind of realized. And then just so thinking about who exists at each of these tiers, like the top tiers are the sort of like massive developers with huge balance sheets. The next tier down are kind of like large developers, usually operating big portfolios. The next tier is kind of like a developer successfully scaling a viable game. So this could be like a smaller developer, but they had a sort of like a viable game, and now they're just scaling it up. They're sort of like adding UA budget, and they're adding UA staff, and they're sort of like slowly but profitably scaling it up. And then the sort of bottom tier is just a small developer with a great game, right? Maybe they have one UA person, maybe it's two, maybe they're just working with agencies, but they're spending money profitably on UA, but it's still like a small developer. So here, if you kind of think about it this way, and this is not, necessarily like philosophical or, hypothetical, this is kind of what I observe in the marketplace, and I don't know, maybe some people disagree. But if you think about what an opportunity looks like, you can kind of think about, well, okay, if it is this sort of like systematic, right? If I have a game that works and I can kind of continuously scale it until, as I'm scaling my game, I'm also scaling my company to sort of support the marketing effort and the distribution effort. If I'm thinking about an opportunity, I kind of have to consider like, okay, what is the sort of maximum tier this game could get to, right? If I'm sort of scaling my company to support this game's growth, like where do I think it could potentially land, right? Because I mean, there is a sort of, there's like a limit, right? Based on the game's monetization and the game's general appeal. I mean, you can't just scale any game to the top 10 grossing. I mean, some games have more potential than others, right? So if I'm thinking about that, I need to think about like, okay, if I'm evaluating a concept, where could it, if I had unlimited resources to hire people immediately, if I could just sort of wave a wand and immediately have a big UA staff and a big UA budget, what's the sort of max potential for this game? Because it would max out somewhere, and maybe that's top 20, maybe that's top 10, maybe that's top 1 or whatever. But when I'm evaluating this opportunity, I have to kind of consider where could it land, right? And then when I'm evaluating which opportunity versus some other opportunity I should sort of pursue, I need to weigh those. I need to weigh that factor for each opportunity. What's the max potential of this? So how do you do that? And I kind of came up with this exercise for thinking about that, right? So it's basically just a 4-quadrant graph, and the kind of y-axis follows appeal, and the x-axis follows kind of like gender resonance, you could say, right? So like a game at the top of the chart would be something that appeals to a lot of people. A game at the bottom of the chart would have like very niche appeal. To the left of the chart would appeal almost exclusively to men. To the right, almost exclusively to women, right? So to sort of identify opportunities and think about, okay, which games in the top 10 grossing, where do they exist on this chart? I could just fill it in by hand, right? I could just go through the grossing list, and I could just kind of think about, okay, does this game, is this mass appeal, and does it appeal mostly to men or women? And I could just sort of fill it in, right? And so it might look like this. And here I'm trying to evaluate opportunities, and I'm trying to think about who the audience for these games are. But doing that is really subjective, it's tedious and kind of time-consuming, and it's also not very scientific. So there are two other problems with this approach. The first is that it's kind of prone to recency bias, which means, okay, I'm only really going to think to put games on here that were sort of like recent hits, right? Just that's the way the human brain works. I'm not going to think back to a year or 2 years ago to the top 10 grossing apps just because I'm not going to remember them, but I'll remember, Pokemon Go, right? Which isn't, Pokemon Go, maybe it'll be top 10 grossing for 5 years. Maybe it won't. But if I'm doing this right now, I'd probably put Pokemon Go on there, even though I have no idea how that's going to do over the long term. And, sorry, just to go back, what I'm really focused on here, if I'm building a game, well, an opportunity is a game that's going to generate lots of money for a long lifetime, right? It's not just about a game that's going to shoot up the grossing charts and shoot down. The best opportunities would be games that would shoot up the grossing charts and stay there, right? I'd be able to support them with marketing for a very long time, and I'd make a lot of money off of them for a very long time. And you're also very likely to focus on one point in time when in reality we want to see a trend in grossing, right? So if I'm doing this exercise, I'm thinking about all these apps, I might open up my app store right now, I'd see the top 10 grossing right now, and I'd fill in the chart that way. But again, those apps might shoot up and shoot down. What I want to see is apps that are sort of consistently able, or sort of like apps that reach the top 10 grossing or top 20 or 50 or whatever position by ascending up the charts, right? Because if they hit top 1 grossing like their first week, it's probably supported by a massive marketing campaign. I have no idea if that was profitable or not. If it ascended up the grossing chart and finally landed in the top 10 grossing, I'm pretty sure that was done profitably, right? Because no one would continue to pour money into a game and slowly move it up the grossing chart if it wasn't making money. You wouldn't be able to do that. You wouldn't be able to lose money for that long. So the better approach to doing this is to use AppAnnie data to find opportunities, score them, and then place them on the chart with that scoring mechanism. So here I came up with kind of like a formula for an opportunity. And so this is maybe a little bit confusing, but I'll explain it in more detail after I go through it. So I'm looking for an app that reached at least the top 50 in the last year, that is not from any studio that has any top 10 grossing game, right? So I want to see a game that reached the top 50 grossing that comes from a studio that doesn't have like a wildly successful hit game. Because if studio does have a wildly successful hit game, it's pretty likely they could push any of their games up into the top 50 grossing. Maybe not profitably, but there might be some strategic reason to do so, right? I'm looking for a game from a studio that hit the top 50 only through like sheer performance of that game, not from being financed from the revenues from another game. And I'm looking for an upward trajectory in the grossing chart. So I want to see a game that hit top 50 and that sort of like ascended to that position. Not a game, so this is all done kind of programmatically. I don't want to see a game that was in the top 50 but is actually on a downward trajectory, right? I want to see a game that's sort of ascending up the grossing charts. And you can do all of this. You can sort of implement that formula and build this chart with free AppAnnie data. You don't need the paid subscription, and you don't need sort of like any proprietary data generated by their own kind of data analysis. You can do this purely with free data, right? And you can either do that by writing a script that kind of scrapes the data off their site, or you can do it by hiring an intern and having them do that manually, right? So it's actually like a pretty cumbersome process to do manually. You have to log in and then go through each day's top 100 grossing chart and like add each game there. It would take a long time, but you could hire an intern to do that. And so I did that. I didn't do it manually. I wrote a script. It produced a 70 megabyte JSON file, so it has 365 days of top 100 grossing chart. The number of apps in the top 100 grossing chart over that period was 355. The number of excluded developers was 56. So the number of developers that had a top 20 grossing game in that period I removed, and that was 56 developers. And the number of apps classified as representing opportunity was 33, right? So of all the apps that were in the top 100 grossing chart in the last year, 33 were kind of opportunities based on that formula that I outlined before. And then to score them, to put them on that set of quadrants, I had my script also pull a bunch of the data off of their individual pages on AppAnnie, which again is free. This is free for anybody to access. And I used app descriptions and screenshots and icons sort of like used some Python modules that do like image recognition and also like just semantic recognition of the descriptions to score them on a scale of -10 to 10, female to male. And then I also use those the images to score them on the sort of mass appeal niche scale from -10 to 10, right? So this script pulls all this data and then it scores them based on mass appeal and gender resonance with some score, right? So it'll place it on the chart. And so and then I built like a heat map based on that. And so and I'll show the heat map after this, but the darkness of the color represents the grossing trajectory, right? So I just use kind of a very simple linear regression of the grossing trajectory and controlled for the rankings. And controlling for the number of rankings, so the number of times they appear in grossing. And so the darker that is, like the more consistent the slope, and then the lighter it is, like the less consistency there is of the slope, or the more sort of straight it is. I mean, horizontal it is. And then the size of the distinct heat spot is the density of titles in that region. And so it looked like this, right? So the dark red spots are the ones that had sort of like up and to the right kind of trajectories, up the grossing charts, and then the big spots are the ones that had a lot of titles in those regions, right? And so you see that the most opportunities, or like the best opportunities, are in the sort of like slightly female kind of middle of mass resonance area of the chart, and then the biggest is like the mostly male area, and then like the sort of the sort of like actually the bottom left is sort of like the darkest red. I couldn't do it with the Google sheet, but that was where like there was like the most sort of money, but the sort of fewest number of titles there, and that's like very male, very niche. So ultimately, I think you're looking for games like, this is Toy Blast from Peak Games, and you see that each dot represents a time that it was ranked in the top 100, and then you see over time the different rankings, and that horizontal line is top 50 grossing, right? So you see it actually ascended from like 100 up to like in the 20s. Well, that clearly wasn't through financing a loss. Why would they do that over that length of time? That did that just through pure performance. It ascended up the grossing chart. It's got no games in the top 20. It's only got a 6-person UA team. So could a team like, I mean, a team like that, you know, they're not deploying huge amounts of money, right? I mean, they probably are, but like I know the people on the team, they're very sophisticated and smart, but they're not brute forcing their way into top 20 grossing. They're doing this in a systematic way, reinvesting profits. And it's there. I've only got like 30 seconds, so I'm going to skip ahead quickly and show. So these are all kind of like up and to the right situations. These would be the kind of games that you'd want to take a look at. Like I did this analysis, you find these games and they say, okay, what audience are they reaching? Because those audiences can support me being in the top 20, right? So this is War Dragons, Jackpot, Party Casino, Slots, Free Vegas Casino, slot machine games, Fishdom. You'd want to look at the audiences that these games are reaching and then try to also reach those audiences, because this data is sort of telling you that these audiences can support a game being the top 20. And then there's Cautionary Tales. And I won't name the games, but this was one that has a big celebrity co-brand. It's down and to the right in terms of grossing. This was a kids show IP license. This was some really, really big developers' new brand launch. Well, okay, this one and another one. So what is the process to implement this? So the first step is to use AppAnnie data to find your opportunity. Which games are achieving top 50 grossing positions based on this criteria, and then which audiences are those games designed for, and then try to reach those audiences too. And then once you've done that, click test fake ads for this potential game concept to make sure that what you're building also reaches that audience. And then this is a quote from Sun Tzu: "If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. And if you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle." So if you know your audience and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 launches. If you know yourself but not your audience, for every rank gained, you also suffer CPI being greater than LTV. And if you know neither your audience or yourself, you will lose money in every launch. So I'll end on that note. Thank you very much. Sorry for going over time.